A young German soldier, no more than 23 years old, sits trembling in a frozen bunker somewhere on the Eastern Front. It's December 1943. Outside, the temperature has dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. But he's not shaking from the cold. His hands won't stop moving. His pupils are dilated, and there's only one thought consuming his mind. Where is his next pill? The small white tablet he craves isn't food. It isn't a letter from home. It's something far more powerful, far more dangerous. It's Eukodal, a drug that promised to turn ordinary men into fearless warriors, but instead created something else entirely. Tonight we're going to explore one of World War II's darkest secrets, a story of medicine twisted into something sinister, of soldiers who became addicts, and of a pharmaceutical nightmare that stretched from the laboratories of Germany to the bloodiest battlefields in human history. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me tell you this story, slowly, carefully, as we journey back through time. Let's begin our story not on a battlefield, but in a laboratory. The year is 1916. World War I is raging across Europe. In a pharmaceutical facility in Germany, chemists are working on something revolutionary. They're trying to create a painkiller more powerful than morphine, but without morphine's dangerous side effects. After years of experimentation, they succeed. They synthesize a compound called Oxycodone. It's smooth, it's powerful, and by 1917, it's being marketed under a brand name, Eukodal. The word Eukodal comes from Greek, EU meaning good, and Kodal referencing codeine. A good codeine, a better painkiller. The marketing wrote itself. In those early days, Eukodal seemed like a miracle. Doctors prescribed it for everything, post-surgical pain, chronic conditions, even severe coughs. Patients loved it because it worked quickly, it dissolved easily, and it provided relief that morphine sometimes couldn't match. But there was something else Eukodal did, something the pharmaceutical companies didn't advertise quite as loudly. It made people feel euphoric, invincible, fearless. By the 1920s and 1930s, Eukodal had become popular throughout Europe. Pharmacies stocked it, doctors trusted it, and most importantly for our story, military officials took notice. Because imagine, if you will, what a military mind sees when they hear about a drug that eliminates pain, erases fear, and keeps soldiers alert and energized for hours. They see a weapon. Now let's move forward to the 1930s. Adolf Hitler has risen to power in Germany. The Nazi regime is rebuilding the German military, preparing for the war they're planning to unleash on Europe. And they're looking for every advantage they can find. German military doctors and researchers begin experimenting with various stimulants and painkillers. They test amphetamines, they test cocaine derivatives, and they test Eukodal. The results are remarkable, concerning, fascinating. Soldiers given Eukodal report feeling no pain, even from significant injuries. They feel confident, almost recklessly so. Fatigue seems to vanish. Hours pass like minutes, and most intriguingly, fear, that most human of emotions, that survival instinct that keeps soldiers alive, simply melts away. But the military researchers are careful at first. They understand addiction. They've seen what happened with morphine in previous wars. They know that opioids can create dependency, so they convince themselves they can control it. They'll only use it in specific circumstances. They'll monitor dosages carefully. They'll rotate soldiers on and off the medication. These were all lies they told themselves, because by 1939, when Germany invades Poland and World War II begins, Eukodal has become a standard part of the German military medical kit. It's in field hospitals, it's in medic bags, and increasingly it's in the pockets of frontline soldiers. The drug even gets a nickname among troops, the hero's drug. At first the system works exactly as planned. Wounded soldiers receive Eukodal for pain management. They recover faster. They return to duty sooner. Military efficiency improves. But then, something begins to change. Soldiers who were prescribed Eukodal for legitimate injuries start requesting it even after they've healed. Some begin complaining of phantom pains. Others develop sudden, mysterious ailments that just happen to require opioid treatment. The military doctors notice this pattern, but there's a war on, there are quotas to meet, battles to fight, and if Eukodal keeps soldiers functioning, well, who's really being harmed? This is the rationalization. This is how it begins. To understand how deep the Eukodal problem went, we need to talk about someone specific, someone at the very top of the Nazi hierarchy, Adolf Hitler himself. Now, Hitler famously didn't drink alcohol. He was a vegetarian. He cultivated an image of discipline and self-control. But behind closed doors, the Führer had a secret that very few people knew about. He had a personal physician named Dr. Theodor Morell. And Dr. Morell was very creative with his treatments. Starting in 1941, medical records suggest that Hitler began receiving regular injections. These weren't normal vitamins or medical treatments. They contained cocktails of drugs, including oxycodone compounds very similar to Eukodal. Hitler's inner circle noticed changes. The Führer became increasingly erratic. His hands trembled. He aged rapidly. He made strategic decisions that defied military logic. Were these symptoms of Eukodal addiction? We can't say for certain, but the timing is suspicious. And it raises a disturbing question. If the leader of Nazi Germany was potentially compromised by opioid addiction, what does that tell us about the decision-making at the highest levels of the war? But Hitler's story is just one thread in this tapestry. Let's return to the soldiers, the ordinary men who found themselves caught in this pharmaceutical nightmare. Imagine you're a young German soldier. Let's call you Friedrich. You're 19 years old. You've been drafted. And you've been sent to the Eastern Front, perhaps the most brutal theatre of World War II. The conditions are unimaginable. The Russian winter is merciless. Temperatures drop to levels that freeze flesh in minutes. You're hungry, you're exhausted, you're terrified, and then your commanding officer or the company medic offers you something, a small white pill. It'll help with the cold, they say. It'll keep you alert on watch duty. Everyone takes them. You swallow the pill, and 30 minutes later, everything changes. The cold doesn't bother you anymore. Your empty stomach doesn't ache. The fear that's been gnawing at you constantly just evaporates. You feel warm. You feel strong. You feel like you could fight 100 enemy soldiers single-handedly. For the first time since you arrived at the front, you feel good. So when they offer you another pill the next day, of course you take it, and the day after that. And soon you're not waiting for them to offer, you're asking for it, then requesting it, then demanding it. This is how it happened, not with dramatic moments or conscious decisions to become an addict. It happened quietly, gradually, one pill at a time. German military records from the period show that Eukodal distribution increased dramatically as the war progressed. By 1943, some units were going through supplies at rates that medical necessity simply couldn't explain. Soldiers were taking pills before battles to eliminate fear. They were taking pills during long marches to eliminate fatigue. They were taking pills at night to escape nightmares. They were taking pills in the morning just to feel normal. And the command structure often looked the other way. Because here's the terrible truth. Eukodal-addicted soldiers often fought more recklessly. They took risks that sober soldiers wouldn't take. They followed orders without hesitation. They didn't retreat when perhaps they should have. From a purely military perspective, if you ignore the human cost, Addiction made soldiers more effective, at least temporarily, but opioid addiction doesn't stay manageable. It never does. And as the war dragged on, the physical consequences became impossible to ignore. Soldiers addicted to Eukodal began showing telltale symptoms. Their eyes looked different, pupils either pinprick small or dilated huge, depending on whether they were high or in withdrawal. Their skin took on an unhealthy pallor. They lost weight rapidly, even when food was available. The tremors were particularly noticeable. Hands that should have been steady, the hands of soldiers who needed to fire rifles accurately, shook uncontrollably. Some men couldn't hold a cup of water without spilling it. Then there were the digestive problems. Opioids slow down the entire gastrointestinal system. Soldiers suffered from severe constipation, sometimes going weeks without proper bowel movements. In the unsanitary conditions of war, this led to additional infections and complications. Sleep became impossible without the drug, but sleep on the drug wasn't restful either. Men would drift into semi-conscious states, neither fully asleep nor awake, dreaming strange, vivid dreams that felt more real than reality. And the dosages kept climbing. That's the insidious nature of opioid tolerance. The amount that worked last week doesn't work this week, so you take more and more, until you're taking doses that would kill a non-tolerant person just to feel somewhat normal. German medical officers began filing reports about soldiers who seemed combat ineffective despite having no visible wounds. Men who couldn't focus, who couldn't follow complex orders, who moved slowly as if underwater. These were withdrawal symptoms, because even with liberal distribution of Eukodal, supply couldn't always keep up with demand. And when addicted soldiers couldn't get their pills, well, that's when things got truly horrifying. Opioid withdrawal is a nightmare under the best circumstances. In a hospital, with medical supervision, it's still incredibly difficult. But imagine going through withdrawal in a foxhole, under enemy fire, in sub-zero temperatures. It starts with a feeling of unease, a restlessness. You can't get comfortable. Every position feels wrong. Then comes the anxiety. Not normal worry, but overwhelming, suffocating panic. Your heart races. You're convinced something terrible is about to happen. Your body starts betraying you. You alternate between freezing cold and burning up. Sweat pours off you even in winter. Your muscles ache like you've been beaten with clubs. Your bones feel like they're breaking from the inside. Nausea hits in waves. You vomit until there's nothing left, then keep vomiting. Diarrhea follows. In the trenches with limited sanitation, this was particularly degrading. You can't sleep, but you're so exhausted that you feel like you're already dreaming. Reality becomes liquid, uncertain, and the craving is like nothing else. It's not just wanting the drug. It's need in its purest, most desperate form. You would do anything, literally anything, for one more pill. Now imagine trying to be a soldier in this state. Imagine trying to follow orders, maintain discipline, watch for enemies, operate weapons. It's impossible. German commanders found themselves dealing with soldiers who were technically present but functionally useless. Some men deserted, not to flee the enemy, but to search for drugs. Others became violent, attacking fellow soldiers they suspected of hoarding Eukodal. There are documented cases of soldiers trading weapons for pills, of men stealing from medical supplies, of troops threatening medics at gunpoint for just one more dose. The military attempted various solutions. They tried forced tapers, reducing dosages gradually. They tried cold turkey cessation. They tried transferring addicted soldiers to rear areas where, theoretically, they could recover. Nothing worked, because you can't solve an addiction problem in the middle of a war zone. The stress, the trauma, the constant threat of death, these all make recovery essentially impossible. And so the Wehrmacht, the German military, found itself with a growing population of soldiers who were physically present but psychologically destroyed. Men who had been turned into addicts not by their own choices, but by the very institution that was supposed to protect them. Chapter 7. The Other Armies, 46 or Forset 52 Anjurus. Now, it's important to note that this wasn't exclusively a German problem. Though Germany's use of Eukodal was particularly systematic, other nations grappled with similar issues. The Japanese military used methamphetamine extensively, creating different but equally devastating addiction problems among their troops. American and British forces used morphine heavily, and while they were more cautious than the Germans, addiction still occurred. Many Allied soldiers returned home with dependencies they developed during treatment for combat wounds. The Soviet Red Army also dealt with addiction issues, though their records are less complete. We know they had access to opioids and used them, particularly in field hospitals, treating the massive casualties of the Eastern Front. But there's something particularly systematic about the German use of Eukodal. It wasn't just about pain management, it was about attempting to chemically engineer better soldiers, to remove the human limitations that normally keep people safe. This was pharmaceutical warfare turned inward. The Germans weren't attacking enemy soldiers with drugs, they were attacking their own limitations. And in doing so, they destroyed their own men. By 1944, as Germany's military situation deteriorated, the Eukodal problem reached crisis proportions. Supply lines were breaking down. Pharmaceutical production was being disrupted by Allied bombing. The drug that soldiers had come to depend on was becoming increasingly scarce. Entire units found themselves in collective withdrawal. Imagine the chaos. Companies of soldiers, simultaneously sick, desperate and under attack. Some turned to desperate alternatives. Anything that might ease the symptoms. Alcohol, when they could find it. Other drugs, often even more dangerous. Some discovered that certain captured Allied medications provided temporary relief. The collapse of discipline in some units can be partially attributed to this pharmaceutical crisis. When you're in withdrawal, military hierarchy means nothing. Orders mean nothing. Only the next dose matters. As Germany surrendered in May 1945, Allied forces discovered the extent of the problem. Field hospitals were filled not just with wounded soldiers, but with men suffering from severe addiction. Medical officers found stockpiles of Eukodal in bunkers, carefully hoarded by troops terrified of running out. The liberation of these addicted soldiers created new problems. They needed medical treatment, but resources were scarce in the immediate aftermath of the war. Many were simply sent home, still addicted, to struggle with their demons alone. The story doesn't end with the war's conclusion. Thousands of German veterans returned home carrying an invisible wound, addiction to Eukodal and other opioids. In the destroyed landscape of post-war Germany, treatment options were almost non-existent. Families who welcomed back their sons, husbands and fathers often found strangers. Men who couldn't hold jobs, who suffered from mood swings and physical illnesses, who craved something they couldn't articulate. Many of these veterans never fully recovered. They moved from Eukodal to whatever opioids they could obtain, sometimes legitimate pain medications, sometimes street drugs, sometimes alcohol as a poor substitute. The shame around addiction was immense. These were soldiers, heroes in their communities, who weren't supposed to be weak, so they suffered silently. And many died silently too, from overdoses, from complications, from suicide. There's a haunting parallel here to modern struggles with opioid addiction. The pharmaceutical companies that claimed their products were safe. The medical establishment that prescribed too freely. the individuals who found themselves trapped in a cycle they never intended to enter. The soldiers of World War II who became addicted to Eukodal were victims of their time. But their story echoes forward through the decades, warning us about the dangers of using pharmaceutical solutions to human problems. So that's the story, the horrifying tale of Eukodal and the soldiers it destroyed. Remember Friedrich, our imaginary young soldier from earlier? His story is fiction, but it represents thousands of real young men, boys really, who went to war and came back changed, not just by combat, but by chemicals that were supposed to help them. The next time you hear about the opioid crisis, about pharmaceutical companies pushing addictive drugs, about doctors overprescribing pain medication, remember that this isn't new. This is a pattern that stretches back through history. The names change, the companies change, but the human cost remains the same. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps spare a thought for those lost soldiers, the ones who survived the bullets and bombs, only to lose themselves to tiny white pills. Their story deserves to be remembered, not as a tale of weakness or moral failure, but as a warning. A reminder that even with the best intentions, when we try to chemically remove our humanity, our fear, our pain, our limitations, we risk losing something essential. Sleep well, and be grateful for your clarity of mind, for your body that functions without chemical assistance, for your ability to feel, even when feeling is difficult. These are gifts. Never forget it. Let's take a moment to explore the doctors, the medical professionals who enabled this crisis, because they have their own story to tell. In the early days of the war, German military physicians genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. They'd been trained that Eukodal was a wonder drug. The pharmaceutical companies had assured them it was safer than morphine. The research seemed sound. Dr. Otto Ranke, a military physiologist, conducted extensive studies on performance-enhancing drugs for the Wehrmacht. His reports were optimistic, sometimes overly so. He documented the benefits, increased alertness, reduced pain, improved morale, but downplayed the risks. Many of these doctors were patriotic. They saw their role as supporting the war effort. When a soldier said he needed Eukodal to function, denying that request felt like betraying him, like sending him into battle without proper equipment. But over time, the signs became impossible to ignore. Medical officers began seeing the same soldiers returning again and again with vague complaints. A twisted ankle that never quite healed, back pain that persisted despite rest, headaches that required constant medication. The patterns were obvious to anyone willing to see them. Some doctors did speak up. They wrote reports about increasing addiction rates. They recommended stricter controls on distribution. They suggested rotating soldiers off the medication. These reports were often filed away, ignored. Or worse, the doctors who wrote them were transferred to other positions. Because in the middle of total war, maintaining troop strength took priority over long-term health concerns. There's a particular tragedy in reading the personal journals of some of these physicians after the war. Many expressed profound guilt. They'd taken an oath to do no harm, and instead they'd helped create thousands of addicts. One doctor, whose name has been lost to history, wrote in his diary, "I gave them pills to ease their pain, and instead I gave them a different kind of suffering, one that followed them home, one that may never end." These medical professionals were caught in an impossible situation, but their complicity, however unwilling, was essential to the system. Without doctors prescribing, without medics distributing, the Eukodal epidemic couldn't have reached the scale it did. Let me share some stories. These are drawn from letters, diaries, and post-war interviews with veterans who survived and eventually spoke about their experiences. There was a soldier named Klaus, a tank commander. Before the war, he'd been a school teacher. Quiet, methodical, thoughtful. He received Eukodal after shrapnel wounded his shoulder in 1942. The physical wound healed within months. The addiction lasted decades. Klaus described the feeling of taking Eukodal as like someone turned down the volume on the entire war. The screaming, the explosions, the fear, all of it became distant, manageable, almost peaceful. He wrote to his wife about how much better he was feeling, how the medicine was helping him cope, how he'd be home soon, good as new. She saved those letters. After the war, reading them again, he wept, because he could see in his own handwriting how the drug had changed him, how his letters became more erratic, how his promises became more desperate. Then there was Werner, barely 18 when he was sent to the Eastern Front. He started taking Eukodal not for pain, but because his commanding officer handed it out before dawn raids. "Take this," the officer would say, "it'll make you brave." And it did make him brave, recklessly, dangerously brave. Werner survived the war, but his memories of those raids are fragmented, dreamlike. He remembered charging enemy positions, but couldn't recall being afraid. He remembered the violence, but not the emotion. The drug had stolen not just his sobriety, but his authentic experience of the war. There was Friedrich, yes, a real Friedrich, not our fictional one from earlier. He was a medic, which made his addiction particularly insidious. He had access to supplies. He could take what he needed without anyone noticing, or so he thought. His company commander eventually realized what was happening when inventory counts stopped matching usage reports. But instead of court-martialing Friedrich, the commander made a terrible decision. He forced Friedrich to continue working, to continue treating wounded soldiers, while addicted. "We need medics more than we need discipline," the commander reportedly said. Friedrich treated soldiers while his hands shook. He made decisions about who received pain medication while craving it himself. He saved lives while destroying his own. After the war, he never practiced medicine again. The guilt was too overwhelming, and there was Johann, who found an unexpected way to survive. He was captured by Soviet forces in 1944 while in the midst of severe withdrawal. The Russian POW camp was brutal, but in a strange way, it saved his life. There was no Eukodal available, none. He had no choice but to go through withdrawal completely. He described those weeks as dying without actually dying, but he survived. And when he was finally released and returned to Germany years later, he was one of the few veterans who'd actually beaten his addiction. Not through treatment or support, but through sheer enforced deprivation. These stories give faces to statistics. Each represents a human life that intersected with Eukodal and was forever changed. Chapter 12. The pharmaceutical companies, 120 Arcticals, 127-1. Now we need to talk about the companies that manufactured Eukodal, because they played a crucial role in this tragedy. The primary manufacturer was Merck, the German pharmaceutical giant. Merck had produced Eukodal since its development, and when the war began, they ramped up production dramatically. The company's archives from this period make for disturbing reading. Internal memos show that Merck executives were aware of addiction potential. They knew that Oxycodone was habit-forming, but they also knew that military contracts were extraordinarily profitable. One executive wrote in 1941, "Questions have been raised about dependency issues with extended use. However, in wartime conditions, with limited life expectancy among frontline troops, long-term addiction concerns may be considered secondary to immediate combat effectiveness." Read that again. Limited life expectancy among frontline troops. They were suggesting that addiction didn't matter because the soldiers would probably die anyway. This is the cold calculation of corporate warfare, lives measured in profit margins, human suffering justified by military necessity and financial gain. Merck wasn't alone. Other pharmaceutical companies provided similar drugs to the Wehrmacht. They competed for contracts. They marketed their products as superior to competitors. They emphasized benefits and minimized risks. After the war, these companies faced surprisingly little accountability. Merck continued operating. Many of the executives who'd overseen wartime production remained in their positions. The Eukodal chapter was quietly closed, rarely discussed. There's a parallel here that's worth noting. In recent years, pharmaceutical companies like Purdue Pharma faced legal consequences for their role in the modern opioid crisis. They were accused of downplaying addiction risks while aggressively marketing drugs like Oxycontin. Oxycontin contains oxycodone, the same active ingredient as Eukodal. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. The companies that profited from Eukodal in the 1940s laid groundwork for patterns that would repeat decades later. Aggressive marketing of opioids. Emphasis on pain relief while minimizing addiction risks. Targeting of doctors with misleading information. These weren't isolated incidents. They were features of how pharmaceutical companies operate when profit takes priority over patient welfare. While soldiers struggled with Eukodal at the front, their families at home had their own painful experiences. Wives received letters that gradually changed in tone. Early correspondence was coherent, affectionate, normal. But as addiction took hold, the letters became different. Shorter, more repetitive, sometimes incoherent. The handwriting changed, shakier, less controlled. Mothers noticed when their sons came home on leave. Something was wrong. Their boys seemed distant, distracted. They ate little. They slept poorly. They were irritable, snapping at family members over minor issues. But what could families say? Their loved ones were fighting in a war. Of course they were changed. Of course they were struggling. The families blamed combat stress, trauma, the horror of war. They didn't know about the pills. Some families did find out. A soldier might confess during a vulnerable moment, or they'd discover the pills hidden in clothing. These discoveries created new kinds of pain. How do you help someone addicted to a drug that's being provided by their own military? How do you stage an intervention when the person has to return to the front in a week? There were no good answers. There's a particularly heartbreaking account from a woman named Greta, whose husband Ernst returned from the Eastern Front in 1943. He'd been wounded and was given extended medical leave. Greta wrote in her diary, "Ernst is home, but Ernst is not here. He looks like my husband. He sounds like my husband, but there's something missing. Some essential part of him has been left behind in Russia. Or perhaps it's been covered over by something else. Something dark that's growing inside him." She didn't know about Eukodal at the time. She only knew that the man she'd married was disappearing before her eyes. When Ernst's leave ended and he returned to his unit, Greta felt relief mixed with guilt. Relief because living with his mood swings and strange behavior was exhausting. Guilt because what kind of wife feels relieved when her husband goes back to war? Ernst never returned. He was killed in action in 1944. But Greta always wondered, was his death truly an accident of war? Or did his addiction make him careless? Did he take risks that a sober soldier wouldn't have taken? She'd never know. And that uncertainty haunted her for the rest of her life. These homefront stories remind us that addiction is never individual. It ripples outward, touching everyone in proximity. Families suffered even when they didn't understand what was happening. Let's take a brief detour to put this in historical context, because the story of soldiers and addiction is much older than World War II. In the American Civil War, morphine was used so extensively that post-war addiction was called soldier's disease. Thousands of veterans returned home dependent on the drug, struggling to readjust to civilian life while battling withdrawal and cravings. During World War I, both sides used morphine heavily. The British and French had serious addiction problems among their wounded soldiers. The scale was smaller than World War II simply because the war was shorter and pharmaceutical production less advanced. The Vietnam War introduced a different pattern. American soldiers in Vietnam had access to heroin, which was cheap and plentiful in Southeast Asia. Studies found that a significant percentage of soldiers used heroin during deployment. Interestingly, many quit successfully after returning home, suggesting that environment and stress play crucial roles in addiction. More recently, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have created new generations of veterans struggling with prescription opioid addiction. These soldiers were often prescribed powerful painkillers for combat injuries and found themselves unable to stop taking them. What makes the Eukodal story unique is its systematic nature. This wasn't just soldiers self-medicating or developing dependencies after being wounded. This was institutional. The military itself was distributing addictive drugs as a matter of policy. The German military treated Eukodal as equipment, like ammunition or rations. It was part of the standard military supply chain. That level of systematization is what makes this chapter of history particularly disturbing. Other nations have had drug problems in their militaries, but few have approached the industrial scale of Germany's Eukodal distribution during World War II. To understand what these soldiers experienced, we need to understand how opioid addiction works in the brain. Don't worry, we'll keep this gentle and accessible. Imagine your brain as a complex communication system. Neurons talk to each other using chemical messengers. When everything's working normally, these messages create your experiences: pleasure, pain, emotion, memory. Opioids like Eukodal hack this system. They bind to specific receptors in your brain, mimicking natural chemicals called endorphins. When you take oxycodone, it's like flooding your brain's communication system with millions of messages all saying the same thing. Everything is wonderful. You are safe. You are happy. Nothing hurts. This feels amazing, but your brain is smart. It notices that these chemicals are coming from outside rather than being produced naturally. So it makes an adjustment. It says, why should I bother making my own endorphins when they're being supplied externally? Your brain's natural production of pleasure chemicals decreases. This happens surprisingly quickly, sometimes within days of regular opioid use. Now you're trapped. When the drug wears off, you don't just return to normal, you drop below normal. Your brain isn't making enough natural endorphins anymore, and the artificial supply is gone. Everything feels worse than it did before you started taking the drug. This is called physical dependence. Your brain has restructured itself around the presence of the drug. Without it, you feel terrible. With it, you feel normal. Not even particularly high, just not sick. For the soldiers taking Eukodal, this process happened while they were dealing with extreme stress, trauma, and physical hardship. These conditions accelerated and intensified the addiction process. The fear that normally keeps soldiers cautious? That's regulated by brain chemistry. Eukodal disrupted it. The pain that signals injury and forces rest, masked completely. The fatigue that forces sleep and recovery, overridden. In the short term, this seemed beneficial. Fearless, tireless, pain-free soldiers. But brains need fear, pain, and fatigue. These are protective mechanisms. Without them, soldiers pushed themselves beyond safe limits. They ignored injuries. They took unnecessary risks. They didn't rest when their bodies desperately needed it. And all the while, their brains were being rewired, becoming dependent, changing in ways that would affect them for years, sometimes decades, after they stopped taking the drug. This is why addiction is so difficult to overcome. It's not a moral failing or lack of willpower. It's a fundamental change in brain chemistry and structure. As 1945 approached and Germany's collapse became inevitable, the Eukodal supply chain began to fail catastrophically. Allied bombing had destroyed pharmaceutical factories. Transportation networks were shattered. Even when Eukodal was manufactured, getting it to troops became nearly impossible. For addicted soldiers, this was catastrophic. Imagine being in the most stressful situation imaginable. Your country is losing the war, enemy forces are closing in, your cities are being destroyed, and suddenly the one thing that's been helping you cope is taken away. Mass withdrawal hit German units across all fronts. Commanders reported entire companies that were combat ineffective, not due to casualties or lack of equipment, but because their men were too sick to fight. Some soldiers deserted not to escape the war, but to search for drugs. They raided pharmacies in abandoned towns. They stole from hospitals. They bartered with civilians, trading anything they had for opioids. There are accounts of German soldiers approaching Allied lines not to surrender tactically, but because they hoped Allied medics might provide drugs for their withdrawal symptoms. Some were so desperate they were willing to risk being shot just for the possibility of relief. The human desperation in these final months was extraordinary. Men who'd been functioning soldiers, following orders, maintaining discipline, suddenly became single-minded in their pursuit of the drug their bodies now required. Military discipline collapsed in many units. Officers couldn't enforce orders when their soldiers were writhing in withdrawal. Courts-martial were held, but what was the point? Execute a soldier for drug-seeking behaviour when the military itself had created his addiction. Some units tried to manage the crisis through rationing. If we have limited Eukodal, who gets it? The most addicted? The most valuable soldiers? Do we give everyone a little bit, knowing it won't be enough to prevent withdrawal? Or do we give some soldiers full doses while others go without? These were impossible decisions with no good answers. Every choice meant suffering. And then finally, the war ended. The supply didn't just dwindle, it stopped completely. Thousands upon thousands of German soldiers went into immediate, severe withdrawal. Allied forces liberating concentration camps and POW facilities found not just Holocaust victims and prisoners of war, but also German soldiers in the throes of opioid withdrawal. The same camps, different kinds of suffering. Germany in 1945 was a landscape of ruin, cities reduced to rubble, millions dead, families destroyed, an economy shattered. And in the midst of this catastrophe, tens of thousands of opioid-addicted veterans trying to survive. The medical infrastructure that might have helped them barely existed. Hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded. Medications were scarce. Trained addiction specialists were almost non-existent. Even if treatment had been available, there was stigma. These were soldiers of the defeated Wehrmacht. In the immediate post-war period, they received little sympathy. They were associated with Nazi atrocities. They were conquerors who'd lost. They were reminders of national shame. An addicted veteran couldn't easily seek help without admitting to drug dependency, which carried its own social consequences. Better to suffer quietly than to risk being labelled weak or morally deficient. So they suffered in private, in destroyed apartments in Berlin, in small villages in Bavaria, in displaced persons camps. They suffered and many died. Some found substitutes, black market morphine, alcohol, which provided some relief from opioid withdrawal symptoms, anything that might ease the desperate craving. The black market in pharmaceuticals became a significant part of post-war Germany's underground economy. Criminal organizations emerged that specialized in obtaining and distributing opioids. They weren't sophisticated drug cartels. Often they were just veterans helping other veterans, trying to survive. There's a particularly tragic aspect to this period. Many of these addicted veterans had families who desperately wanted to help them but didn't know how. They watched their loved ones deteriorate, not understanding that this was a medical problem, not a character flaw. Wives left husbands. Parents disowned sons. The social fabric that might have supported recovery instead created additional trauma. Some veterans did recover, gradually over years. They went through withdrawal multiple times, relapsing and trying again. Some found support through churches or community organizations. Some simply endured until their bodies finally readjusted, but many never recovered. They lived diminished lives, always one step away from relapse, carrying the dual burden of war trauma and addiction. You might expect that such a catastrophic pharmaceutical disaster would lead to lasting changes, that the medical and military establishments would learn from this terrible chapter. And yet, in the Korean War, just 5 years after World War II ended, soldiers were again using opioids extensively for pain management. The drugs were different, primarily morphine rather than Eukodal, but the patterns were similar. During the Vietnam War, the problem escalated. American soldiers had access to prescription painkillers, morphine, and cheap heroin. When they returned home, many brought dependencies with them. The military medical establishment repeated many of the same mistakes. Overprescribing, inadequate monitoring, treating addiction as a discipline problem rather than a medical issue. But perhaps the most striking parallel is the modern opioid crisis that began in the 1990s and continues today. Pharmaceutical companies, including descendants of the same companies that manufactured drugs during World War II, began aggressively marketing new opioid painkillers. Oxycodone, introduced in 1996, was marketed as safe and non-addictive for moderate pain. This was remarkably similar to how Eukodal had been marketed decades earlier. Downplay the risks. Emphasize the benefits. Assure doctors it's safe. The results were predictable. Addiction rates soared. Overdose deaths climbed. Communities were devastated. And once again, pharmaceutical companies profited enormously before facing consequences. The parallels are disturbing. Military veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan wars often struggle with opioid addiction, having been prescribed painkillers for combat injuries. The patterns from World War II echo forward through 80 years of history. Why haven't we learned? Perhaps because the benefits are immediate while the costs are delayed. Opioids genuinely do relieve pain. They do provide psychological relief from trauma and stress. In the short term, they seem to work. It's only later, weeks, months, years later, that the true cost becomes apparent. By then, the pharmaceutical companies have made their profits. The prescribing doctors have moved on, and the addicted individuals are left to struggle alone. The story of Eukodal should have been a warning. Instead, it became a template that's been repeated, with variations, throughout the decades since. Chapter 19, Remembering the Forgotten, 2109, Wilaxes, 2.16, Thax. There's something particularly tragic about how thoroughly this story has been forgotten. When we discuss World War II, we talk about battles and strategies. We discuss the Holocaust and war crimes. We analyze political decisions and military tactics. These are all important, vital topics that deserve attention. But we rarely discuss the pharmacological warfare waged on soldiers by their own institutions. The veterans who survived battle only to lose decades to addiction are largely absent from historical narratives. There are no memorials to soldiers who died from Eukodal overdoses. No museums dedicated to pharmaceutical casualties. No commemorations for families destroyed by military-sanctioned addiction. These stories exist in fragments. A mention in a medical journal. A footnote in a military history. a brief paragraph in a veteran's memoir. They've been scattered, marginalized, forgotten. Why? Perhaps because these stories complicate our narratives about war. They don't fit neatly into tales of heroism and sacrifice. They reveal institutional failures. They show how the very organizations meant to protect soldiers instead harmed them. There's also shame. Veterans addicted to Eukodal often didn't want to talk about it. Their families wanted to forget. The military preferred not to acknowledge the problem. The pharmaceutical companies certainly had no interest in highlighting this chapter. So the memories faded. The evidence was buried in archives. The survivors died, taking their stories with them. But these stories matter, not just as historical curiosities, but as warnings, as evidence of patterns that continue today, as reminders of what happens when we prioritize short-term effectiveness over long-term well-being. Every veteran who struggled with Eukodal addiction was a human being. They had names, families, dreams, futures that were stolen by a drug their own government gave them. They deserve to be remembered, not just as statistics or cautionary tales, but as individuals who suffered, who tried to serve their country and were betrayed by the institutions they trusted. In remembering them, we honour their humanity, and perhaps we create space to finally learn the lessons their suffering tried to teach us. Chapter 20. Modern Echoes, 2.16 Nags, 2.23 Thinonhaus. Let's bring this story into the present day, because it's not really historical at all. It's current. Right now, today, veterans around the world are struggling with prescription opioid addiction. The drugs have different names, Oxycodone, Vicodin, Percocet, but they contain the same basic compounds, Oxycodone, hydrocodone. Different packages, same problem. Modern military medicine has improved in many ways. We understand PTSD better. We have better trauma care. Soldiers survive injuries that would have been fatal in previous generations. But we're still prescribing opioids, still creating dependencies, still sending veterans home with pill bottles that will haunt them for years. The US Department of Veterans Affairs has struggled with this issue. Studies show that veterans are prescribed opioids at higher rates than civilian populations. They're also more likely to receive high doses for extended periods. Why? Combat injuries cause real pain. PTSD and trauma create psychological pain that opioids can temporarily mask. The stresses of military life and deployment create conditions where addiction develops rapidly. It's the same pattern. Different war, different decade, but fundamentally the same story as Eukodal in World War II. There have been improvements. The VA has implemented prescription monitoring programs. They've trained doctors to recognize addiction risks. They've expanded access to alternative pain management treatments. But progress is slow. And in the meantime, veterans are dying from overdoses, from complications of addiction, from suicide driven by the despair of dependency. The civilians affected by the opioid crisis face similar struggles, but veterans face unique challenges. They may have legitimate chronic pain from injuries. They've been trained to push through discomfort. They may be reluctant to admit vulnerability or seek help. And there's another parallel worth noting. Just as Eukodal was manufactured by pharmaceutical companies that profited handsomely, modern opioid manufacturers have made billions from these drugs. Purdue Pharma, before its bankruptcy and legal troubles, earned enormous profits from Oxycontin. The Sackler family, who owned Purdue, became billionaires while communities drowned in addiction. This is exactly the same dynamic as Merck profiting from Eukodal production during World War II. Corporate profits, individual suffering, institutional enablement. The story repeats. Chapter 21. What recovery looks like. 2.23. 2. 30 years. Let's talk about something more hopeful, because while the story of Eukodal addiction is dark, recovery is possible. It's difficult, but possible. Some World War II veterans did overcome their addictions. Their paths varied, but certain patterns emerge. First, there had to be acknowledgement. Admitting the problem existed was the essential first step. As long as the addiction remained secret, recovery was impossible. Second, there needed to be support. Family members who didn't judge. Friends who understood. Medical professionals who treated addiction as a disease rather than a moral failing. Third, there had to be alternatives, something to replace the drug. For some veterans, this was work, throwing themselves into rebuilding their lives and their country. For others, it was faith, family, or community service. And fourth, there needed to be time. Recovery isn't quick. The brain needs months, often years, to restructure itself after addiction. Patience is essential. One veteran named Heinrich left a detailed account of his recovery. He'd been addicted to Eukodal for 3 years during the war. After returning home in 1945, he went through withdrawal in his mother's farmhouse. He described the process as learning to be human again. His brain had to relearn how to feel pleasure naturally, how to experience pain without medication, how to sleep without pills, how to face fear and stress without chemical numbing. It took him 2 years before he felt mostly normal. Even then he experienced occasional cravings, a stressful day, a reminder of the war. Suddenly he'd want the drug again with overwhelming intensity. But he developed strategies. He'd talk to his wife. He'd go for long walks. He'd pray. Whatever it took to get through the craving without giving in. Eventually the cravings became less frequent, less intense. Heinrich lived to be 87 years old. He had a family, a career, a full life. But he always said that his addiction was never truly gone, just managed. It was a part of him, like a scar from the war. Modern addiction treatment has built on these insights. We now understand that recovery is a process, not an event, that relapse is common and doesn't mean failure, that social support is crucial, that addressing underlying trauma is essential. Treatment options have improved. Medication-assisted treatment can help ease withdrawal and reduce cravings. Therapy helps address the psychological components of addiction. Support groups provide community and understanding, but the fundamentals remain the same as in Heinrich's day. Acknowledgement, support, alternatives, and time. These are still the pillars of recovery. I want to share something with you. In a German archive, there's a letter that was never sent. It was written by a soldier named Thomas in April 1945. He died before he could mail it. The letter was found in his pocket when his body was recovered. The letter is addressed to his younger brother, who was 14 at the time. Let me read you portions of it. Dear Wilhelm, by the time you read this, if you ever do, the war will be over. I hope you never have to serve as I did. Not because of the fighting, though that was terrible enough, but because of what they gave us, what they made us take. They called it medicine. They said it would help us fight better, and it did for a while. But Wilhelm, it took something from me, something I don't think I can get back. I don't feel things properly anymore. When I think about home, about you and mother and father, I know I should feel warmth, love, but there's something in the way, a fog. The only time I feel clear is when I take the pills. And the terrible thing, Wilhelm, is that I'm not sure who I am without them anymore. Am I the person I was before the war? Or am I this new person, this changed person, who needs chemicals just to feel normal? I'm afraid. Not of dying. I've faced death many times and somehow survived. I'm afraid of surviving, of going home and being a stranger in my own life, of needing something that may not always be available, of becoming a burden to our family. If I don't make it home, perhaps that's for the best. Better to remember me as I was than to see what I've become. But if I do make it home, please understand. Whatever happens, whatever you see, know that I'm trying. That beneath the changes somewhere is still your brother who taught you to fish, who walked you to school, who loved you. I'm sorry, Wilhelm. I'm sorry for whatever pain this brings. I'm sorry I couldn't be stronger. Your brother Thomas. This letter breaks my heart every time I read it, because Thomas represents thousands of soldiers who felt exactly the same way, caught between who they were and what the war had made them, understanding what had happened to them but feeling powerless to change it. Thomas's brother Wilhelm did eventually find the letter decades after the war. In an interview when he was an old man, Wilhelm said, "I wish I could tell him that he was strong, that surviving addiction while fighting a war required more strength than anything else he did, that I would have loved him no matter what, that he should have come home." But Thomas never got to hear those words, and neither did so many others like him. There's another group we haven't discussed much yet, the children of addicted veterans. Growing up with a parent struggling with opioid addiction creates its own kind of trauma. Children didn't understand what was wrong. They just knew that their father, because it was usually fathers who'd been soldiers, was different, unpredictable, sometimes absent even when physically present. Margot was 7 years old when her father returned from the war in 1945. She'd been waiting for him for so long, excited to finally meet this man her mother talked about constantly. But the man who came home wasn't the hero from the stories. He was thin, jumpy, often sick. He spent hours in his room. He snapped at small irritations. And there were pills, always pills. Margot learned to be quiet, to not upset father, to pretend everything was normal when neighbours asked how he was adjusting. She wrote in her diary decades later, "I learned shame before I learned to read fluently. Shame about my father's illness that we never named. Shame about our family's secret. Shame that I sometimes wished he hadn't come home at all." Children like Margot often became caretakers. They monitored their parents' moods. They hid the problem from outsiders. They grew up too quickly, taking on adult responsibilities while still children. Many of these children developed their own mental health struggles, anxiety, depression, difficulty trusting others. The trauma passed down to the next generation, and sometimes, heartbreakingly, the addiction passed down too. Children of addicted parents are at significantly higher risk of developing addictions themselves. Not because addiction is directly inherited, but because of the complex interplay of genetics, environment, and learned behaviours. There's a woman named Anna whose father was a Eukodal addicted veteran. He struggled for years before eventually taking his own life when Anna was 12. Devastated, Anna grew up determined never to touch drugs. But in her 30s, after a car accident, she was prescribed opioid painkillers. Within months, she found herself trapped in the same cycle that had destroyed her father. The thing she'd feared most, the thing she'd sworn would never happen, had happened anyway. Anna did eventually recover, but the process forced her to confront her father's struggles with new understanding. "I spent my childhood angry at him," she said. "I thought he was weak, that he chose pills over his family, but once I experienced addiction myself, I realized how strong he actually was. He fought for years. That he lasted as long as he did was a testament to his strength, not his weakness." These intergenerational impacts of the Eukodal crisis extended far beyond the veterans themselves. Families were reshaped. Childhoods were altered. The echoes continued for decades.